Dr. Kinsey. Ooh, Dr. Kinsey. I just read your essay on men's behavior today, and men are great, like a hole in the head. I used to get such comfort wrapped in the arms of males, but now I find that less than 60% go for us frails. I used to think my lover knew some fine, fancy tricks, but according to Kinsey's data, he's strictly from the sticks. Ooh, Dr. Kinsey, look what you...
Shalom, good evening. My name is Reva Gambert. I'm the director of the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival, and welcome to our bonus event for the documentary Cured. The film is underwritten by Samuel Pitlock, my husband and myself, and also a Wider Bridge and Congregation B'nai Tikva's Social Action Committee. It is in memory of my Uncle Lee, who unfortunately was subjected to electric shock treatment in order to cure him of being gay. I also want to mention an upcoming program after the festival on April 28th, 29th, and 30th. The film festival is partnering with a Wider Bridge, an LGBTQ national organization, and the Consulate General of Israel on a special innovative series called A Wider Lens. And we are streaming free the Israeli documentary, We Were the Others. On April 28th at noon, California time, the filmmaker Hadass Ayalon, I think that's how you pronounce it, will be with us live with an interview about the making of the film. To get a ticket, and it's free, please go to eastbayjewishfilm.org and you can get a ticket for the interview with the filmmaker as well as the film itself. The rest of the week, and we are now going into the second week, we still have some great films. Holy Silence, which started today, is available for 2 more days, as is Cured. We then have a beautiful Israeli film, A Lullaby for the Valley, the documentary Ma'abarot about Israel in the early 1950s. The film was shown many years before, but it's still a winner, Left Luggage with Isabella Rossellini and Maximilian Schell. We're then showing The Dead of Jaffa, as well as on closing day, the Italian drama And Thou Shalt Not Hate, and a light drama, sort of a dramedy called Golden Voices. If you have a question, please do ask questions. That's sometimes the best part of any presentation. Please use your chat feature located at the bottom of your computer screen, and we'll ask questions of our speaker. And our speaker, and I'm so glad she is willing to share her thoughts and her knowledge with us, is Dr. Dana Beyer, who will be speaking, and then followed by Q&A. I'm only going to read a few of her accomplishments, otherwise we'll be here for maybe 20 minutes on just that. She is a retired eye surgeon who served 8 years as executive director of Gender Rights Maryland, the state's trans political organization, and which worked the Maryland Gender Identity Bill to passage in 2014. She was inducted into the Montgomery County Human Rights Hall of Fame in 2014. A graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, she was awarded the 2020 Women in Medicine Award. She served 9 years on the board of Keshet, a wonderful national LGBTQ organization, and is currently a director on another wonderful organization, the National Board of A Wider Bridge, which builds relationships among Jewish LGBTQ communities here and abroad. And it goes on, and on, because she really has done so much working for uh, human gay rights, health issues. And I should add, she was a member of the work group at the Washington Psychiatric Society that wrote the gender dysphoria text of the World Health Organization, which is declassifying being transgender as a mental disorder. And that was my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dana Beyer.
Thank you very much, Riva. It's an honor to be here with you. It's a little late for me, but you know, that's what happens on the East Coast. It's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that last experience that I had working with the Washington Psychiatric Society to write the new text for the new DSM. And I will explain to people as background to this wonderful documentary why the DSM matters. It shouldn't matter, but it does. So the guys who produced this wonderful film, Cured, Andy Tobias and Mel Heifetz are colleagues of mine, and I applaud them for this because it's very well done, and it's only, what is it, about an hour and 10 minutes, and it really encompasses that entire moment in history from 1970 to 1974. Now, as a disclaimer, I wasn't a part of that. I was at Stonewall on Saturday night, June 29th, 1969, but I was not a participant in this removal of homosexuality as a mental illness because I hadn't even started medical school until 1974. But I learned from this, and I learned a great deal, and that knowledge, and with the assistance of my colleagues who also learned from this, we were then able to do the same for the trans community in 2011 as the gay community had done in 1973. It took them only 3 to 4 years, depending on how you time it. It took us over a decade. There are reasons for that. I may get into them as far as the history goes, but I don't think we would have accomplished what we did if they hadn't accomplished what they did. And the most important point, the most important political point is there would not have been a gay rights movement of the significance that we've seen over the last 50 years unless they had accomplished this. And the longer it would have taken them to accomplish this act with the American Psychiatric Association, which I will call the APA from now on. The American Psychological Association is also an APA. They're not a part of this. They don't write the Bible. Unfortunately, we give that power to psychiatrists. And I'll talk about that a little bit too. But it was destigmatizing being gay. That was the critical political, legal act that unleashed the movement for gay liberation. Because whether we like it or not, there is a lot of stigma associated with mental illness, a lot of bigotry. I don't know why we do that. I don't even call it mental illness. I call it brain disorders because that's what it is. And the brain is as much an organ as our genitals, which is obviously a big issue when it comes to gay and trans people. So we treat brain diseases differently than we treat, kidney diseases and lung diseases and the rest. And we look at them in a way that really cripples us from moving forward and dealing with issues. And this is a Jewish film festival, right? This isn't an LGBT film festival. So I can talk about the fact that in the Jewish community, and you mentioned your uncle, I believe, who was subjected to EST. I was threatened with that too when I was a kid, when I came out to my parents. But it's interesting. I came out to my parents first when I was 7 and then again when I was 11, and they threatened to have me institutionalized in the state mental hospital, which was 2 miles away from us on Long Island. But it's in talking to them later after I completed my transition and we finally connected as human beings and as a family. It took 50 years, but we got there. They were more concerned back in the 50s and the 60s with the fact that I had a quote unquote mental illness than that I was trans. It wasn't the sex and gender stuff that freaked them out. It was simply the shanda, the scandal that I had what was classified as a mental illness. And they were afraid of telling people they were taking their, at that time, son to see a psychiatrist. They just couldn't deal with that. And I have cousins who've gone through the same thing because they're bipolar. And I have a nephew who was bipolar and was ignored for the longest time and ended up doing street drugs. And he's been paying a price ever since. So there is this within the Jewish community specifically, but also in the community at large, this stigmatization of being mentally ill. And, up until maybe, I think it was 10 years ago, the US government didn't treat mental illness and somatic illness the same way as far as insurance goes. We finally changed that, but it took a long time to get there. I mean, Congressman Kennedy actually led that. I remember working a little bit on that with him. And because of that stigma, you really can't move successfully through society. And that stigma follows the community through our laws and through our courts. Now, for better or for worse, we've imbued the psychiatric community with the power to define what is and what isn't normal when it comes to mental health. I don't know why we did that. We would have been better off with psychologists. I can say that the trans community has really benefited from the elevation of psychology and licensed social workers to the forefront, as psychiatrists were the most conservative, most reactionary, most resistant to change over the past 50 years. And that matters because the courts will look at it and say, oh, you're mentally ill, therefore I'm going to treat you a little bit differently than I would treat anybody else. When the DSM changed between numbers 4 and 5 in 2011, that allowed open trans military service, which finally came about in 2016, thanks to President Obama and Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. It was then put on hold for 4 years because of the former guy, and now it's back into play. But some of you may be old enough to remember a movie followed by a wonderful television series, one of the most popular in American history, called MASH. And there was a character on MASH called Corporal Klinger. And Corporal Klinger was a crossdresser. Maybe he was a crossdresser, maybe he was trans, or maybe he was just trying to get out of doing his military service. But that stuck with the trans community for 40, 50 years. And the Pentagon basically used that. They said, well, you obviously have mental illness and we're in charge of this, so we're not going to let you serve. This isn't like the gay don't ask, don't tell, which was a law. This is just a military administration decision that we don't want mentally ill people serving with us. Changing the DSM, destigmatizing, de-psychopathologizing, removing trans as a category of mental illness allowed the community to then push the Pentagon to do all this research, take all this into account, and decide, well, if trans people aren't mentally ill, then we have no reason to ban them. So that was the first very public example of the advantage of changing that DSM. Going back to cured, to 1973, everything that came after that, which obviously was sort of stuck in between 1981 and 1995 with the AIDS epidemic, but all of that came about is because we were able to come out and tell our friends, families, and neighbors that we were gay, and as a result, that stigma faded away, and nobody could then go, but psychiatrists say you're mentally ill. I like the title Cured because it is a fact, and it was mentioned in the documentary, that with just one fell swoop, basically, the vote of the APA in that referendum in 1974, millions of people were cured right now. They were never sick in the first place. So it's a little, it's kind of cute, but they were literally cured. And by changing the DSM for trans people, that gave me the most pleasure, having been a part of that, having written that text, that suddenly, 1 million or 2 million, actually now, 0.6% of the population were cured of being mentally ill. There's just something satisfying in that. We've all been sick. We've all had the flu. We get over it, we're cured. Or a doctor comes in and gives us an antibiotic or something and we're cured. Here, we cured millions of people just in one fell swoop. But it took a great deal of effort to get there. And to me, the takeaway from this film is that the effort that those gay men, for the most part, and some lesbians, but mostly gay men, put into undermining the DSM-2 is the same kind of effort that it takes to do anything. And we're seeing it now play out on issues of race. You need people inside the system who can write the laws that change policy, that change the courts and all that. But you also need many more people on the outside demonstrating, rallying, pushing legislators to do the right thing. It's exactly what these guys did. That they did it in 3 years, 3.5, 4 years, back in the early 70s is absolutely remarkable. And I think it's simply a fact that there was so much pent up energy in the late 60s, particularly as the war was winding down, that manifested itself in gay rights and in women's rights and the like, the anti-abortion, the abortion movement, and then the anti-abortion backlash. There was just so much going on at the time that things happen very rapidly, sort of the way technology changes, these days. And those guys don't get that much credit anymore. There's a photo that's up there from a rally here in DC where Frank Kammeny's holding up the sign, "Gay is good." And Frank coined that term. And I knew Frank back in the day. I think he passed away in 2011 or 2012. Frank wasn't that trans supportive, but Frank was an older guy and he didn't really know many trans people, and he put all his energy into gay is good and just trying to change the federal government. And he was the first one to do it. And he was a lone voice for many, many years. And I think he's smiling in this photo. I don't remember particularly what demonstration that is, because he's got all these people surrounding him. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, to be the first one to step out. And then probably the most important person is the second one who steps out and validates that person. And then everybody else looks and goes, well, okay, it's not just one crazy person out on a limb. There's a second person supporting that person. And then everybody starts to jump in. But that's sort of what it takes. And I learned from these guys, because I studied this after medical school and such, to see what would happen. And I think the film does a really good job of explaining. There was that one guy, John Fryer, who was wearing a mask. He would show up at events, at APA events. And there were others who came out and talked about it. And they worked on the inside, and they got Robert Spitzer eventually, involved in just look at the research. People had done research on homosexuality back to the 50s, right? Evelyn Hooker in 1956. It's not like this was a political decision. There was plenty of research that gay people weren't mentally ill. But because America, certainly post-war America, was caught up in the Freudian moment, which viewed homosexuality as a mental illness, it was very hard to break through. And we know the power of consensus and how crowds control others. We see it now in our political culture, that it's very hard for somebody, even in a medical community, to stand up and go, everybody, I think you're wrong on this. There's no evidence for this. It's time to change. These people who are out here knocking on the door and stuff, you ought to listen to them, bring them in, and it takes time to get organizations that are as conservative as tradition bound as the American Psychiatric Association to listen to that, to bring them in. And then, to their credit, scientists do this. We listen to the evidence and we change our positions based on the evidence. And over the course of 3 years, what do I have here? Let's see. The first challenge was in 1970. There was an APA meeting in LA in October of 1970. And by 1973, the New England regional chapter of the APA decided to depathologize homosexuality. And then the full board voted just in December of 1973. Now, Charles Socarides, the father of gay Clinton staffer Richard Socarides, wasn't happy with that. He demanded a referendum. He got the referendum and he lost. But that was just in April 1974. So, I mean, in the course of 4 years, just a few guys who were willing to come out and stand up and speak their mind, and occasionally yelling and shouting, but for the most part, talking science, talking civilly to their colleagues, were able to change a significant majority of the organization. I mean, more people voted to remove homosexuality than voted to leave the European Union and the UK 5 years ago. So, it's that's 58% is pretty significant. The polls have always been higher than that. The American people are far more supportive. We see that politically speaking too, right? I mean, like 90% of Americans want some sort of serious gun control, and no Republican senators want it. So we have to live with that. It takes time to bring about that change. And sometimes there are structural inequities that inhibit that. And we have that problem with the filibuster and such now. The trans part of this is an interesting story that wasn't mentioned in this film, but it's a part of the history. Back in the 60s and the 70s, many trans people, particularly activists, called themselves gay. Trans was not really known in America for the most part until Christine Jorgensen came home to the Bronx in December of 1952, which was the year I was born. She was a pretty much staple on the Tonight Show during the 50s, but didn't make much of an impact. And it was only in 1966 when Johns Hopkins started performing genital reassignment surgeries and created the first gender identity clinic, which was interestingly called the Sexual Behavior Consultation Unit. That says a lot. And the name of that has sort of stuck in the minds of many right-wing medical practitioners, because being trans in the classic sense has nothing to do with sexual behavior. But the people at Hopkins, John Money and his colleagues and that whole crowd, who, to their credit, were willing to recognize trans women, and they're almost all women in those days, and do what they could to help these women live their lives as themselves authentically. They didn't see trans women as trans women. They saw them as gay men who were embarrassed about being gay men, but wanted to be penetrated sexually, Sexual Behaviors Consultation Unit, and therefore were willing to go to the extreme measures of having a vagina created rather than having anal sex. And when they did intakes on potential surgical patients, all the questions were about sexual behavior. How do you like having sex? On top or bottom? Where do you, and all that. Nothing about who are you? Who do you think you are? And we know now these days, the two major political issues here, because the Republicans, better known as the American Fascist Party, have nothing else. They have no policies. They're just attacking trans people, whether they're trans high school athletes or trans kids with respect to getting medical treatment. The fact is that everybody has a gender identity. Everybody knows by the age of 3, maybe 4, of course there are exceptions, but for the most part, everybody knows whether they are a boy or a girl by the time they're 3 or 4. And the only ones who generally argue with that assignment, the assignment that's made at birth by an obstetrician and a pediatrician, and then imposed by parents who follow the genital assignment, are trans kids who just say from the age, I mean, I know somebody from the age 2.5, but that was unusual, but from the age of 3 or 4, whenever you have the guts to come out to your parents, I did it at 7, but others don't do it till after puberty. But you just say it, and you say it again if you're allowed to, if you're not beaten to a pulp, which many of us were back in the 60s. You just say it again, you're insistent, you're consistent, you're persistent. Those are trans people, not that many of them. It's interesting today to hear people say, how can there be trans kids? Well, all trans adults were once kids. I mean, this idea that somehow you just wake up one day and decide I'm going to be trans and go through all of this is absolute nonsense. We've made that point. That narrative exists, and it exists for a reason, because most people follow some form of it. Not everybody's the same, and not everybody has the exact same story, but there are patterns that are consistent. And there is a consensus in the medical community today, because there is experience treating trans people, and there is science, there is neuroscience, there's neuropathology from trans people who had died that proves that trans women have a female brain, certain nuclei in the brain, not the whole brain. I'm not saying that women all have one type of brain and men have another type of brain, but there are nuclei, little foci of cells within the brain that focus on certain aspects of life. And one of the primary aspects of life has to be what your sex is, because that will drive how you go through your life. And most people will reproduce, and it's important to know whether you are male or female to do that. Similarly, homosexuality is the same thing. It is an independent brain function. We don't know where in the brain that is quite yet. It's interesting that the research on the roots, the gay genes, so to speak, which is what it was called in the late 80s and early 90s, has not progressed nearly as quickly as all the research on trans people. But because of all that research, there's been a consensus in the medical community, the American Psychological Association, the social workers, the AMA, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is the most important one now because we're dealing with kids and adolescents, have all recognized that, yeah, trans people exist and they're kids, and then they grow up to be teenagers, and that's awful. And then they grow up finally to become adults, just like everybody else. And it would be nice if people just sort of got that sort of basic narrative down, because it's pretty obvious and we've all gone through that one way or another. An interesting little factoid would be that, you had asked me earlier, when people know what their gender identity is. Gender identity is not really the right term for this. We were stuck with it because the gay community had chosen sexual identity, and so we had to come up with something else. Also, we tried to desexualize being trans because, as I mentioned, in the 60s, the professors, the scientists all thought being trans was about having sex. And they thought, and this went through, even today you'll find it, but it used to be very prevalent that, well, trans people, like gay men, they're all florists or they're hairstylists or they're sex workers, because it's all about sex and stuff like that. And it took a long time for people to recognize that such a thing as a sexual identity, or what we call gender identity, exists. So we managed to desexualize transsexual to transgender. And today we just cut it off because we shorten everything and it's trans, no pun intended. But gender identity was only proven to exist in a scientific sense in 2004, which was just a year after I completed my social and medical transition. So in some respects, this is relatively new. That was 17 years ago. And even the most resistant, the most bigoted professors, including the guy who killed the gender reassignment program at Hopkins, Paul McHugh, finally in 2004 acknowledged that, okay, I guess this is a real thing. But I can tell you, having spoken to many groups over the decades, that guys in particular simply cannot understand that it's not about looking down and seeing whether you have a penis or not, that it's something that's far more embedded in your being. It's about, the ego, the I do this, I do that. Your sexual identity is right there. It's in the layer right above that. And we have a pretty good idea of where it is. So, it's hard to come out and have to listen to people go, well, you have no proof for any of this, because we do have some pretty good proof of it. So I wanted to mention that, so it took them 3 to 4 years for these guys to get homosexuality, quote unquote, removed from the DSM-2, but they didn't succeed completely. That was the first step, and it was the biggest step, but it only removed what was called egosyntonic homosexuality, which meant gay guys who were cool with being gay. What they didn't want to do is they didn't want to deprive psychiatrists of the business of trying to cure ego-dystonic homosexuals, the guys who were gay and were unhappy being gay. They wanted to keep doing conversion therapy. And so there was a diagnostic code in the DSM, DSM-2 and the DSM-3 until 1987. And as a bone to throw also, they didn't remove the trans community. So in 1980, they coined a new term called gender identity disorder, because they viewed, as I said, trans people as sort of extremely gay people, which must have meant that, yeah, if you were extremely gay, then you were really sick. And so they needed a category to deal with that. And when we finally removed gender identity disorder in 2011 and replaced it with gender dysphoria, which anybody can really have, it's just a feeling that there's something a little wrong with you, we didn't completely remove it from the DSM either. There are still categories of transvestic fetishism and such that pathologize behaviors that they wanted to keep in just so they could deal with people whom they thought were mentally ill or who thought themselves that they were, and they needed a diagnostic code. Because at the end of the day, it's not a secret, but we have these coding systems, the DSM or the World Health Organization's ICD, which is more important, that gives codes so doctors can bill, right? It's all about billing for your services and your time. The good news is that the WHO is almost completed its ICD-11, which completely depathologizes being trans, not just takes it out of the mental illness category, but takes it out of the illness larger classifications completely. So, and that's a global phenomenon. The problem is the US doesn't necessarily jump onto that, which is, again, I'm sure not a surprise to most people watching this, but I do think since we used the ICD-9, we sort of ignored the ICD-10, there's going to be a push to bring it up to date because 30 years is a long time to update your diagnostic codes. And again, doctors need to be paid. And if we're in a system where doctors do get paid by the work they do and not as part of a national health service, it really does matter. So that's one of the advantages of having a public-private healthcare system. And to be fair, just the way they needed ego-dystonic homosexuality in it, because there were guys and some women who didn't like being gay back in the 70s and 80s and wanted to be cured. There are trans people who need medical care, because if you're going to transition medically, hormonally or surgically, you need to see a doctor, an endocrinologist, therapists, surgeons and such. So you need to be able to code people out on that. So the documentary paints with a broad brush. There are all these nuances that are involved in it. And, you got to work. You have to put the time in on the ground to be able to figure these things out. You have to find the people who are a little bit more sensitive about these issues that might be allies, and you talk to them, and maybe they have a gay kid or a gay nephew or something, and they're willing to listen. And we found that with the trans community too. I had a friend here in Montgomery County in Maryland who was on the board of trustees, and he was my point person to get this job done. But it wouldn't have been done without the effort of all the activists, of all the people who had come out and started organizations and gotten parents involved. This thing happened in 73, 74. It's an interesting point that PFLAG began in 1972. That wasn't the first gay movement, but it was the first one that brought family into it intimately. And PFLAG, of all the national LGBTQ organizations these days, was the first one to recognize the trans community and started reaching out to trans parents and trans people. So something else that they deserve a lot of credit for. Do you have any questions? Is there an audience that has any questions or?
Thank you. And there are a few questions. One of my colleagues transitioned in his 40s. And I know I used to teach congregational school. There were twin girls who became transgender men. What is the average age now that people are more familiar with the trans community and it's less hidden? What is the average age now as compared maybe to the early days?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. And that sort of goes along with how many trans people are there really, right? Because a lot of the attacks we get today they're based on data out of the UK, not out of the US, but all of a sudden there are all these trans kids and, where did they come from? And it must be social contagion and all that. But over the past 25 years, people have been asking me, how many are there? And, where do they come from? And is there more or there's less? Is it because the culture has gotten more receptive and welcoming, or what have you. It's really hard to know when you are a marginalized community that where the research was never done in the first place. You might find it hard to believe, but up until the mid-aughts, the medical profession, particularly the psychiatric profession, believed that the prevalence of trans women, and up until at least the turn of the century, there weren't very many out trans men who identified as trans. There are many women who were very butch and lived as men and such, but not the other, they were not considered an issue. And misogyny, of course, played a role in this too, and what the way the physicians, the psychiatrists, as mostly men, viewed this homosexuality and transsexualism. But it used to be believed that only like 1 out of 232,000, I think it was, 1 out of 232,000 males identified as trans. I mean, and I just told you earlier that we actually make up 0.6% of the population. That's only 6 out of 1,000. That's not a lot. I guess you could call that rare or uncommon, but it's not 1 out of 232,000. And part of you can go back and look at the way that data point, which was repeated over and over and over again, was never valid in the first place. And that's the way you promulgate, belief systems, and you convince new people who are coming out of medical school or psychiatric training to believe in a certain model based on data which was never good in the first place, but then just gets promoted over and over again. And we do that too. We finally did a national trans study, the NTDS, in 2008 and updated in 2015. And there was one question about suicidal ideation, and it wasn't well written. It was very limited, and suicide's a very complicated issue. And there is contagion with suicide. But the number that came out is that 41% of trans people have attempted suicide. I think every trans person was suicidal, in their minds at some point, and maybe frequently. I certainly spent most of my teenage years being suicidal, but I never did anything about it. And most trans people don't. But on the other hand, some do. And I know trans people who did kill themselves, mostly because of their families' refusal to accept them in any way, shape, or form. And when you hear talk about detransitioners, for the longest time, until at least recently, most of those people detransitioned not because they woke up one day and said, well, I guess I'm not really trans, I'm not really a woman. They just couldn't deal with the stress of losing their families, being rejected by their families, losing their jobs. There are still trans people that live, trans women who live as men during the day and go to work and then come home and live as women afterwards, simply because they have no choice financially. And the economic system simply doesn't allow it. Now, that's improved much over the past 25 years, but still. And, back in the day, a friend of mine, Ricky Wilchins, who was the organizer of the first national trans movement back in 1994, Transsexual Menace was the first organization that started doing rallies at the end of the AIDS epidemic. She has written in the past couple of years that our generation of late 50s, 60s, 70-year-olds, the post-war generation, are basically dinosaurs. You're probably not going to find many people like your friend who come out at age 40 as the years go by. Right now, there are far more teenagers who come out. Part of that is because it's easier. There's more acceptance. There are gender clinics around the country in major metropolitan areas in blue states. And when there's a trans person in your high school class, it's a lot easier to have the courage to come out when somebody's already done it. And then maybe there are two people. Like I said earlier, it's hard being Frank Kameny and being the first person out there. Then the second person comes out, and suddenly it's not that difficult anymore. So there are more and more. I don't know what to tell you. It's interesting, you talked about twins. There is evidence that there is a genetic component to this. And I believe, as do many scientists who deal with this, that being trans is simply a form of intersex, a purely neurologic form of intersex. And I've done research on the impact of toxins called endocrine disruptors, which impact human sexual identity. It's been known for 30 years that the compound called DES, diethylstilbestrol, which was used by many of our mothers back in the late 40s, early 50s, and up until 1971, when it was finally banned by the FDA, causes transsexualism. I was part of the team that proved that. It had been known before that it causes an increase in homosexuality. So how can a drug do that? It works epigenetically. That's a whole different issue. I'm not going to get into the molecular biology of this, but I have a colleague, Milton Diamond, who's getting on in years, but has done a lot of the basic biological research on intersex conditions and trans conditions. And he collected a whole bunch of trans twins and even trans triplets. And there are a whole bunch of various intersex conditions that have a gender identity component to them, that we have pathways, metabolic pathways that pop up in utero that then have an impact on us as human beings as we're growing up. So it's fascinating stuff. It's, if trans people didn't exist, we'd have to create them, because the possibilities in human sexual development are myriad, and there are many opportunities for things to go a little different. Not awry. It doesn't necessarily kill you, but it changes you and you turn out differently. So what percentage of the population is gay now? 4.2%, something like that. And trans population is 0.6%. It's not a lot, but again, it's not that little. I just live a block away from DC, and 10% of the population there identifies as LGBT or Q. And these days, there's the whole Q stuff, which is above and beyond trans stuff. It's just like, I know a bunch of cis straight people who are identifying as queer now because it's chic to do so. But
Another question, what other types of legislation would you like to see in regard to both gay and trans issues and individuals?
Well, that's an interesting story, and it's very topical now too. When I became chair of the board of an organization called Freedom to Work, which was working to pass ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which was first introduced in 1974 by Bella Abzug in New York, and became an issue in 2007, which was really the political coming out of the trans community in America. Barney Frank was intimately involved in that, and a lot of trans people hate Barney, and it came up again in 2013. We actually got 64 senators, including 12 Republicans, to support it, but the House was in Republican hands, and John Boehner, he of the crying over his wine guy these days, just wouldn't let it even come up to a vote. Well, so when we took that over, our goal was to get the Obama administration to expand the federal executive order for federal employees, which is no small thing because it covers like 23 million people. And we did that. And I coined the phrase back then, no gay left behind. Because the fact is, in the 21st century, the trans community, trans plaintiffs, won every single one of their circuit appellate decisions, but one in the past 20 years. There was not a single gay win until 2015. Now, the wonderful lesbian Jewish professor from Georgetown, Chai Feldblum, who's been working on this stuff for 30 years and became the first openly gay EEO commissioner, thanks to President Obama. She was the first one to get the commission unanimously to protect trans people in 2012. That's the Macy decision. She then did it for gay people in 2015 in the Baldwin decision. And after that, the dam broke and marriage equality happened in 2015. And then last July, 9 months ago, the very conservative Supreme Court, led by Neil Gorsuch, of all people, the guy who should have been Merrick Garland, wrote the Bostock decision, which basically gave trans and gay people full rights under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And that's where we stand now. And so the LGBT community is protected under federal law, thanks to the Supreme Court, believe it or not, more thanks to the efforts of Chaim Feldblum and a lot of gay and trans attorneys who've worked on textual analysis of that law and other laws to convince this SCOTUS to do it. So we have protections under Title VII, and that implies Title IX and Title VI, all those things, healthcare and all of that. So all these attempts to deprive trans kids of healthcare and stuff are going to fail in the courts because the Supreme Court's already ruled. However, in order to clear this up, it's always better not to depend on a Supreme Court decision, but to have Congress pass a law. That's called the Equality Act, which is simply the updated version of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, because it includes more than employment. It includes housing, which is also covered to a large degree under the Bostock decision, but it also includes public accommodations, because the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was primarily about race, Title II was about public accommodations, was only about race and national origin, did not include because of sex. So one could find situations where women are prohibited from going to the movies somewhere because they're not protected on the 1964 Civil Rights Law. So the Equality Act expands that, clarifies that. It clarifies to a degree the religious exemption issue, which is built into American law and American history and is never going to go away. We're never going to resolve that. But we tinker with that at the edges and we make great progress. So once we get that passed, then I am hoping that Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, Kirsten's a friend of mine, will agree to kill the filibuster at least for civil rights issues. Number one, voting rights, the most critical thing in order for this country to survive for the next, 3-4 years. And number two, the Equality Act and any other civil rights acts we come up with, because they're absolutely a necessity, and the filibuster isn't even in the Constitution, and we shouldn't let that kill these things.
Even
So that equality, if people want to get involved and work on anything, get involved in your organizations and just push for the Equality Act. And that's really all about killing the filibuster for that to get those votes.
So we have time for 2 more questions. One is, if you want to talk about it, what are the rights in Israel? The organization of which you're a director is very involved with LGBTQ also in Israel. What are the rights today? And what are we looking at one particular political party, which...
Yeah, I know. And it's terrible, but in some respects, it's like what we went through here. Being an adult who grew up from the age of the 60s and then watched it all begin to unwind beginning in 1981, I've spent my entire adult life living through the political reaction to the 60s and the 70s. In Israel, the same thing has been happening for the past, one could say 10 years since Netanyahu came back in 2009, but certainly accelerated over the past 4 to 5 years. And now we have an openly Kahanist party in the Knesset. Meir Kahana, by the way, was my language teacher in yeshiva back in 1968. So, I knew the guy. He wasn't quite as crazy then as he became. And today, Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir, those guys are just out of their minds, but they're also out of the closet. So people know, and even the non-insane Likudniks and stuff are going to have to deal with them, and they can't simply ignore them anymore. So it's an opportunity to stand up and just say, this, thou shalt not pass. This is just not going to go. So in that respect, that's okay. The interesting thing about Israel vis-a-vis the US is that in the US, cultural social acceptance of both gay and then later trans people occurred before the legal equality. In Israel, it's been the opposite. Legal equality for gay people began in the 90s, and for trans people about the same time. The issues weren't quite the same. And again, we were like 10, 15 years behind on trans issues. But the cultural acceptance outside of the Republic of Tel Aviv has been much slower to come about. And I have family, half my family is there, and I know a bunch of gay people and stuff. And, You know, in some respects, just the way gay kids out on the farms here go into the big cities in order to be themselves. And the same thing in Israel. They moved to Tel Aviv, and Palestinians moved to Tel Aviv to get away from homophobic parents in Palestine. So you have that situation. There aren't very many doctors or surgeons who deal with trans people in Israel, so many of them leave the country. But you know, many people leave the U.S. too to go to Thailand and do what do they call that, vacation surgeries and stuff, where you can recuperate on the beach in Phuket. It's a lot nicer than doing it in a hospital ward or something, or on the
Yeah, we
street.
showed, I think it's now a year ago, no, 2 years ago, A Family in Transition, which is an excellent Israeli film about um, a husband who announces, who goes through the process and is a trans woman. It was quite good if anyone can find it online. And also the films of Eitan Fox, which don't deal with trans issues, but almost every one of Eitan Fox's films has a major gay character in it. Um, some people have said that early on, there were a lot of negative images of trans individuals because you had films like The Silence of the Lamb, where Buffalo Bill, who was the serial killer, was viewed as, whether or not he was or not, but as someone who could possibly be trans, maybe not. And also a film with Michael Caine, Dressed to Kill, in
Yeah,
which
but you missed, wait a minute, Reva. I mean, I know you're younger than I am. You're about what, 45 or something? But
definitely, not really, but
you don't remember the transphobic movie by one of the greatest auteurs of all time, Alfred Hitchcock, in 1960?
yeah,
Right?
yes, yes,
Psycho was the one that set the tone. Silence of the Lambs was 30 years later and brought it up to date for our generation. My parents wouldn't let me go see Psycho, not because I was trans, but because they thought I would wet the bed or something. But that set the standard. And it took a long time to change that. One way to actually follow that, and I've done it over the years, is Law and Order is obviously an American obsession, all the different, particularly SVU and stuff. You can watch the way Dick Wolf and his writers dealt with trans issues beginning about the time of Buffalo Bill. You know, Clarice and Buffalo Bill are back now too.
yes.
Right, great. But you can follow it like from 1990 when Law and Order began all the way through to today when a trans issue pops up. They don't pop up that often anymore because it's not that, you know, titillating for people. I remember when CSI did its 100th episode and it was about a crazed trans woman murderer and stuff. That has changed and you can follow that. Somebody's going to do a dissertation on this, just reading the scripts and doing cuts of this, the way they spoke about trans people in the 90s compared to the aughts and then the teens. And I remember there was an episode of SVU where they actually had a scientist present to the police department the biology of being trans. And it was the first really sensitive portrayal of a trans victim, because, you know, as it was true with gay people, if you had a gay person in a movie, that gay person was going to die before, you know, it's sort of like with Chekhov. If there's a gun in the first scene, the gun goes off in the third scene. If there's a gay person in the first scene, that gay person does not survive to the ending credits. And these days wouldn't survive to the intra-credit Marvel Cinematic Universe, you know, the scenes and stuff like that. They just didn't do that. The Children's Hour, right, about gay female sex, you know, that was a warning to you lesbians out there that you better be careful, right? And that was what we grew up with, and that has changed over time. And today it's much better. I mean, you see people coming out. There are now, with the streaming, everybody's writing stuff, and there's all this stuff for kids, and I can't keep track of it. You know, movies, not quite as quickly per se. Like there was one where the guy, what's his name, won an Academy Award, where it was about, again, I mean, they would have trans sex workers and trans addicts and stuff, and it's like, you know, okay, yes, but that's not the majority of the trans community. You know, one of the things people don't know that probably the most important trans woman who's ever lived, Lynn Conway, is the woman who created the VLSI chip, which powers all this Zooming that we do today and all of our phones and all the rest. She's trans. She transitioned in 1968 at IBM and they kicked her out. But she wrote the textbook that created the chips that power our world. Martine Rothblatt created Sirius Radio and such, and then makes drugs for rare disease disorders. People don't know this because those are feel-good stories, right? It's better to do, well, a trans woman was murdered here, which is terrible. It's the number one problem in our community. We have to deal with it. It's been going on for 50 years. It's another one of those things that it's under the radar. People have to step up and have to work inside their communities to change it. But things are much better. You can come out. I've taught trans health in medical schools, and there have been, in more recent years, there have actually been trans students. I mean, this is something back in 1975 when I was in medical school. I remember sitting in a behavioral science lecture and being told that people like me were perverts. And then 37 years later, I was invited back to give that same lecture in the same auditorium to that second year class that had to listen to it 37 years earlier, and I gave them the facts as they existed in 2013. So sometimes you just have to have patience, and as Senator Warren said, persevere. You just have to persevere through it. It's not easy. It's not easy answering questions like this all the time when they get more personal, but people are curious. They want to know. The way to break through to acceptance is to get to know somebody. The most important action for the gay community wasn't really removing homosexuality from the DSM. It was coming out. When people came out, people knew more, and people knew people who knew, and the trans community's done the same thing too. Caitlyn Jenner, whatever you think of her, and God hope she doesn't run for governor of California. I mean, her coming out was an eye-opening experience because everybody remembered her in 1976 winning the gold in the decathlon in the Montreal Olympics. That's powerful, right? We are a celebrity-based culture. We pay attention to that stuff, and it changes things. So we need more positive, uplifting stories. And the other thing that I mentioned earlier, which I want to reiterate, the most important attribute that a queer child of any sort can have going forward is family acceptance. This has been proven over and over and over again. If you grow up in a family, it doesn't have to be complete acceptance, but there's got to be tangible acceptance that child feels that there's somebody there. There's a witness, there's a caregiver who understands them and will work with them. That's the most important factor in leading a good life as an adult. It was true in the 60s, it's true today. And you can see that with all the parents who are standing up in these legislatures and saying, I have a trans kid. What are you doing? What's wrong with you? What kind of a parent are you? Senator so-and-so or Representative so-and-so. So that's the most important thing. I mentioned PFLAG being formed in 1972. It's amazing how powerful that is. Especially moms. Moms just, they won't let you get away with anything. So we need more and more of that, and it's happening. And times are changing, and this next generation will come up with its own stuff, and we'll see where it goes. I'm just happy being a nana now, so it's like,
Wonderful.
yeah.
I want to thank you so much. I also want to remind people of two excellent organizations, Keshet, which can help people as they may transition or come out or just feel authentic in who they are. That's Keshet.org, and A Wider Bridge. And speaking of A Wider Bridge, our film festival, the Consulate General of Israel, and A Wider Bridge are partnering for A Wider Lens, April 28th, 29th, and 30th. We Were the Others, a documentary about several gay men and their experiences in Israel, coming out and living their own lives. You can get your free ticket at eastbaydjewishfilm.org. Thank you, Dana. You are a wealth of knowledge, and you really have made a difference with all of your advocacy. Be well, and thank you, and keep on doing the stuff you do.
Thank you very much, Reva. You too. Take care.